Cool. So, welcome to the corner of my dining room. Fairly sure it's familiar for most people. Will be like, yeah, you're just doing it from home. So, I tend to ramble. I tend to get quite excited about this stuff. So, if you've got any questions or anything like that, just drop them in. There's no such thing as a stupid question. I'm not going to tell you that we've got all of this sorted. I'm not going to tell you we've got it perfect. It's just our journey. I'm also going to assume that maybe a bunch of you have never heard of design systems before. So I'm going to do a little bit of walking through what they are before going on our journey. Yeah, by the way, this is a bit weird. I've not done a remote talk before. I have no idea how many people or who you are. So hello. So roughly, this is what I've structured it into. A really quick intro into what design systems are, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. It's easy to get confused with exactly what we mean by that. We're then going to go back a few years at the beginning of our journey with all of this stuff at AutoTrader and try and give you a bit of context as to how did we manage to get started on our journey, what problems did we have, what do we think actually went well from all that, and then at the end just kind of wrap it up with some of our learnings and also where we're going with it all, because again it's a journey, it's a big thing, and so that will all become clear over time. So I guess first of all, why do I call it people first design systems? I mean, I guess it helps to differentiate from just talking about them anyway. But I also think that's been the biggest learning, certainly for me, is that you can have amazing code, you can have amazing design, but it's always got to be about people. That's why we're doing all this stuff. And so it can't just be design, despite being a design system. It can't just be code. You can't just have an amazing component library, because really it's all about solving user and business problems. That's why we're doing it. That's the important thing. And really all of it is just about communication. It's about shared understanding of what the problems were, how did we solve them, how do you use a design pattern, how do you get the most out of the collaboration. So it's probably more for me about communication and people than it is about all the other stuff, the artifacts and the structure. So hopefully you'll see through this, there's a bit of code, there's a bit of design stuff, but underlying it all comes the people bit. So the bit of walking back through the introduction, for those of you that haven't heard of design systems before, the reason why it gets a little bit lost in language is because you can't point at it and say, that's a design system. You might think you can, because you see component libraries or style guides, and these are parts of a design system. They're not always the whole thing. It depends on your needs and your organization. So to help with it, there's things like, there's a few quotes sprinkled throughout, but this one from Jeremy Keith does it pretty well. So it kind of references pattern libraries and style guides and all these artifacts, but really it's about the framework, the rule book, and how all the patterns work together. It's kind of the less tangible bit, because you can easily point and say, yeah, we've got a component library. We've solved the problems. You've solved some problems. And I think there's something about this cohesion, something about design patterns, which are an abstraction, which is really, really interesting. And seeing it as a framework where it's not just your components. It's not just having a library in your design tool. It's so much more than that. So for a while now, you've seen animation that doesn't work. That's disappointing. Hey, there we go. So loads of massive companies of all sizes have publicly shared their design systems, very often the component library aspect. And so it's not a new thing. It's something that loads of very, very big companies have done very successfully. And really, when you start looking through, there's a lot of similarity. That similarity might be component libraries are structured in a similar way. We're talking about similar things, but there are differences. And I think the reason why there isn't just one design system that everyone uses is because of really understanding how your organization works, understanding your communication needs, all that kind of thing. Certainly one of the earliest I was aware of, certainly in the UK, was gel that the BBC used. Certainly when they first made it public, it was like, oh, this is really interesting. There's some structured patterns that you'll see across the whole of the BBC, which was really interesting stuff to watch from afar, and even more interesting when you actually use it. And so there's a centralized team working around shared patterns that every product around the whole organization might use. And they've got some great documentation around it, not just about it's a component, but what's the thinking behind it, how you can bake in accessibility, how you can respond to user feedback and improve patterns. So definitely worth checking out to this day. And you've got companies which might be more technical, like GitHub, where it's very much, it's clearly not one of the most beautiful ones, but it's definitely functional. You've got a lot of support there around loads of utilities, how you compose GitHub. Google's material design is really interesting because it brings in loads of stuff about motion and about different interaction patterns across different platforms. So it's not purely a web thing, it's a Google thing. How do you use the Google aesthetic and interpret the UX for different platforms? So there's some really interesting stuff in there as well. And also the way at the top there, they've split it into design, develop, and tools. You're like, that's kind of interesting, but is that the right way of dividing it up? For years in the UK, we've had the GDS, the Government Design Services Design System. I forget. But it's worth exploring because that was a massive, massive undertaking. How do you make all government and regional parliament, whatever, these things that I can't remember the words of, how do you make everything seem similar? How do you make it have common conventions? How do you get the best practice from some really quite complicated forms? So that wasn't just how do we make things look similar, it's how do we solve problems? Through a lot of government services, you've got lots of form-based stuff. You've got lots of quite complicated things that you might only ever do once in your life. So there's loads of things about the service design and how to communicate that more effectively to users. So it's really interesting space to look at. I also really like what Bulb have done as well, because again, as an energy provider, they could be incredibly dry, very, very functional. But there's some great stuff within solar, which I'm going to come to a little bit later as well. So an example of something like this might be taking a button is always a good example. Now, if you look at a button, you design a button, you code up a button, that should be the end of the story, but even these simple things are more complicated than you think. So within Solar, it's a good example where they've got a simple chunk of opening copy saying, right, this is the buttons area. What are we talking about when we're talking about buttons? Just try and give you some context. Then they go down, and for each type of button, there'll be a visual example. There'll be just a bit of context as well, but there's some great links there. Like you can look at the code example, but this bit underneath about the research insight is brilliant. It's not just here's a button, now go and use it. When they learn stuff, when they do user testing, they bake that into the design system. And so like many, you've got this link to open the editor and have a look at the code examples. So it's catering for different kinds of audience. At a higher level, you should be able to be a non-technical person, maybe not a designer, be able to say, all right, we have some buttons. What buttons do we have? And in the copy, there's enough context so you get an understanding of what's going on. You've got the visual reference, so you think, well, as a designer, I now have enough knowledge to go, well, this is our primary call to action. That's for that purpose. And then here you can see, well, I'm a developer. How do I actually use it in my code? And I've got some examples there. So thinking of another quote, I came across this one from Nathan Curtis from a little while ago, which is focusing more on the artifacts that Jeremy Keith kind of referred to in the beginning, where it's kind of a library of all these different things with documentation. And it could be that you do it on your own. It could be a massive team, but there's things at the bottom there about making it more efficient and cohesive, which is really important. People don't have a design system to say they've got a design system, because that'd be a massive waste of time. It's to try and make sure there's efficiencies where you've got solved problems and make the whole output feel really cohesive, because there's a lot of work gone into individual patterns that work well together. They're not just random components. So I'm going to have a coffee break. That's good. So yeah, if you got any questions about that first chunk, drop them in the chat and we can pick that up later. There's loads and loads of great people out there doing some brilliant work, like Shopify. I've got one called Polaris, which is really good. They've got some great people on their team. There's so many which are really worth looking into. Why have they made the decisions they've made? And then try and work out, in your context, what can you learn from that to try and make something that gives value. So now I get to tell you about AutoTrader. And so like the subtitle for this feels apt, because the site's been around for a long time. It is kind of like adding foundations after the house has been built. The site's existed for quite a long time, and like any site that's lasted a long time, there's lots of legacy. There's lots of different things to deal with. And now we're trying to bring in this cohesive, efficient way of working. How do you even do that? So for the older people in the audience, or maybe your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or ancient ancestors, we used to be a print magazine, and there was regional variations all over the country. For the car buying and selling people, this was big. And so obviously that was into the 90s. It's crazy. It's probably about a decade ago now where we stopped being a magazine and went entirely digital. So that transition from something like 40 years of heritage of being a print-based thing, starting from a very small regional, I think it was Thames Valley it started in, growing up to be a massive print operation, and then becoming this huge digital beast, is quite a journey. So I'm not going to go into all that, except for we used to be this, and now we're this. So under the hood, there's a lot of stuff going on. Internally, as a company, there's been a huge shift over the years to become a truly digital business. And you know, I've been there almost 4 years, and it really is pretty amazing what they've done. So looking at that, I mean, there's a big takeover, there's a search form, there's a bunch of stuff. You could oversimplify it and say, well, there's a search form, there's some search results, and then some adverts. But there's loads more going on than that. So if you wind back a few years, what was the problem that we were trying to address? There's standard things about common design patterns, or a rebrand or a refresh of the brand that just took too long. They were massive undertakings. There was also a lack of consistency. And that's both from a code or design point of view, where it just didn't feel as joined up as it should be. And so you sometimes get that mismatch where actually there were duplicates of the same patterns. A header was one of the worst examples, where in the code there was quite a few variants of essentially the same thing, which is obviously a problem. At that point, the consumer website and the tool that we have for dealers and franchises called Portal, they shared the same branding. They don't now. But then you've got different tech stacks between those two products, as well as those two products having legacy, probably multiple levels of legacy. So how do you join stuff up that is fundamentally different? So when you start looking through it, there's just lots of different kinds of code going back quite a way. So obviously, design systems will make all of this go away. That's what we're talking about. It's obviously the right thing to do. In theory, It made a lot of sense. But you can't just say, by the way, can we have a team of people just make a design system that then won't be contributing to solving users' problems or business needs? That's a really hard thing to try and get around. Everyone's busy. All the teams have huge backlogs. There's new features. There's addressing tech debt or product debt. How on earth could you change that when you've got different code bases, different bits of legacy, and trying to make things better? So I like to think what we did was think about people more than tech first. It's really easy to say, here's a technical solution, we can do it all. The harder thing is to get people to contribute to it and use it. So for our reality at that point, it's kind of early days where in the consumer space, we were starting to adopt React. In the portal space, they were using Angular. And it was quite early days for both of those frameworks a few years ago. So each were experimenting with component libraries of some kind. So in the newer tech in both of those platforms, there was a divergence, and it was kind of that learning curve of figuring out how it works. There's also this sense of looking at all those examples from earlier on, right? Everyone's doing this. All the big companies have public-facing design systems. So it's a good opportunity to pause and reflect, like, is that right for us? Just because it's the thing people are doing now, we had to really question it. We also had to question, if we do a thing, should it be public? I think there's an argument saying that it really helps with visibility, with hiring, all that kind of thing. But I think then there's a lot of pressure on trying to make sure the public-facing aspects of your design system is well branded, really well executed. Whereas fundamentally, we're starting from nothing, solving internal problems. And the worry is, we might be able to tackle this, but would there be too many compromises? Or would we somehow make it just not actually solve all the problems we've got because of aiming for this thing that we felt we needed? So there's 8 steps that I've broken it down into what I think we did. At that point, I was fairly new to the company, and I think that actually helped in some ways because you don't already know everyone. So a lot of prodding and asking who would be interested in talking about this stuff. And so we got a good rounded group of people together, from designers to people looking after web platforms, front-end, back-end developers, test engineers, just to find out who was interested in that space and just get the lay of the land. So understanding the landscape we're working with, technically, design-wise, product-wise, delivery-wise, in the round, how did all these things work together? What was the space that could actually help in? And to be honest, in that group of people, if you felt there really wasn't an appetite for this, then it might just be a labor of love for one person going, no, but I really believe it's the right thing to do, and pouring all these hours into it. But what would be the point? Maybe you could do all-nighters and go crazy and try and make a thing you know is the right thing to do. But really, if people aren't interested, it's an uphill battle. So in that room, if the people that came together said, you know what, it's nice, but it's too busy, we've got too much else to do, or I don't think it's that important, then fair enough, maybe it's not the right thing for us at that point. Bearing in mind people's backlogs and work and stuff like that, we had to be pragmatic. You're not going to be able to whip up a design system and then impose it on everyone by next week. It's just not going to happen. There's a lot of moving pieces to even make a noddy example like a button. There's a lot of communication that needs to happen. There's a lot of moving pieces that need to fit together. So part of that, we did a proof of concept, funnily enough, around a button. It seems to be the go-to example. So there's loads of questions about how do we make something shareable at all? There's lots of different technical approaches, but based on how the platforms were working and our entire technical infrastructure, what were the things we could prod at and see if we could make a really good internal use mono repo of some kind? How would people commit to it? How would you actually consume it within your apps? how did we get the conversations between developers and designers working better? So that proof of concept was quite rough and ready, but trying to prove out some of those ideas quite quickly. Could we even do this? And really, again, this hammers home the people bit. It's like there had to be a feedback loop. You can't just say, we've done this, now use it. You can, but then you're going to rub people up the wrong way. I think the feedback loop is really important because it's how you structure the conversations around it. Try and make people feel they're a part of this whole journey, even if they don't directly contribute. And so we spent a lot of time just talking to people and trying to listen to their concerns or anything that worked or didn't work quite early on. And there were a lot of differences. Obviously, if you've got multiple implementations of the same kind of patterns, like typography, like buttons, how do you rationalize the differences and go, this is now the source of truth. This is the one button that we have. There's lots of different variants out in the wild on the live site. And so we had a previous kind of typography structure. Didn't really work. Borrowing from gel, which is what I was used to, we rationalized the typography. And as gel does with using movable type terms from back in the print days, being a car company, we have car names for our typographic hierarchy, along with these use cases. I mean, I hate all this stuff, so that's going to go. The main thing was it brought us together across different code bases and different designers to say, this is our typography. And that conversation alone was really significant to work out how we can try and speak the same language. And with those abstractions, you can change values. You can do what you want with them. So developers and designers would talk about these terms. So if you typeset in Phantom as a subheader, in code, you call it Phantom. And there wasn't duplication of font sizes or line heights anywhere. It was a useful abstraction. So all that community and feedback loop stuff is great, but at some point, someone needs to own it. There's a lot of responsibility in this. You've got to make sure that you don't just put it live and walk away and get busy again. There's that sense of responsibility of providing something that at some point everyone will rely on. It's quite a burden, but it's also quite exciting. So off the back of all of those steps, it also meant we could start to bring some better practices. Things that I think everyone knew were important that we wanted to do, but we could bake it into some of the workflow and some of the tooling and components that we provided. One of the main things being that, certainly historically, people didn't maybe feel they were well informed enough about accessibility to do it well. People who are less technical maybe didn't understand it well enough to see that it is a priority. One of the things that we've always been keen on is trying to, for want of a better phrase, call it design pairing, where you've got a designer and a front-end developer collaborating on a thing in real time rather than throwing designs over the fence. By trying to pair on a computer together and work out what a component or a thing should be, it's really quite satisfying when it works properly. Unlike all this other stuff, all the history that we went through, there's a lot of existing conversations that happened in pockets around the business. And so there was a lot of overlap. There's lots of ways of bringing them together. So this piece of work really helped as a hub for all these conversations. So people could come and talk about a thing, and then we'd plug them in with other people. It really works as a conduit. And so while we had these separate component libraries kind of evolving in newer technology in both these products, it really made us think about how we share code across the business. And code of any kind. How do we do the sharing thing better? So part of encouraging participation meant that it wasn't just designers and developers going off in a corner and coming up with a thing. We really tried to include lots of people, even that guy. So product owners wouldn't directly use this. They're not designers or developers, but understanding why we've got what we've got and what we're talking about is important. We had some content type people who set standards of tone of voice and how we talk about things. And that goes into microcopy on buttons and all sorts. Again, like the bulb example, how do we bake in some of the research findings into the components, like what works and what doesn't? And test engineers or QAs, whatever you have, making sure they're involved at the beginning, because they're the gatekeepers of quality. And so you can't just say, we've made everything and now good luck testing that. Having them in at the beginning and think about what can we test as we go through? How can we make it so that you're on that journey with us was really important. And so there was a little bit of going back to basics, like on a wall or on bits of paper going, okay, we have this, at that point, red primary button. What are the constituent parts of our buttons and how might they change if we change values? Again, a simple example. And we went from that into our old sketch library, which worked well for quite a while. And it was a really simple library of just shareable design assets. We didn't really have it much before this, and that really helped accelerate it and give it some kind of structure. So the output of that process came to a project we call Sparkplug, because we're a car company. And so this was just sharing CSS. And so because of all the different tech stacks from Java to Angular to React, all this sort of stuff, that seemed like the one layer we could really try and join together. So you could have some consistent, reliable structure, namespaced classes, whatever it might be, that you can pull into your project and you can get on brand and move along. And so in there, there's things that we saw, like references to how you might apply the classes. So there's kind of object orientated, you use ITCSS as a structure and use BEM as a naming convention. So we felt pretty good that these things were used in different ways across the business, and we kind of arrived at a pattern that worked for us and was relatively clear of how to use. And we had the prefix ATC because we originally called it core. But then at that point, everything in the business seemed to be called core. So Sparkplug. So then in the consumer space, as an example, we had and still have a shared component library of React components. So then you've got, within a particular domain, in this case React on the consumer platform, pulling the styles from Sparkplug and applying them to components. So you kind of see how this notion of sharing and getting consistency was starting to get some traction. A lot of it was independently. Like there was this notion of shared components, and this sharing the styles, it helped with that consistency. And some code. I don't know why I put that in there, to be honest. So the outputs were, we had a design that is consistent, because you shouldn't be designing buttons. That's a solved problem. So things like that, you started to see were a lot more predictable, a lot more consistent across the site. There were also less different implementations. As much as we could at that early stage, trying to really bake in stuff like the research we had, A/B tests, accessibility audits, all those kind of things to think about what we could actually address, considering that it was mainly the SAS, the CSS that we were sharing. And so it helps us be so much more collaborative. And we only served out the CSS that was needed. There wasn't just a huge load of bloat. And we have a CLI, which then pulled it into every app. So the downside, again, with the ownership piece, there has to be someone to shepherd it through. And that doesn't have to be an individual. There has to be a collective will to keep it moving on, to keep making it better. And you have to accept that just because you're excited, people don't always have time to contribute. With the best will in the world, people are busy. The reality of that situation is that we had a massive site, and you can't expect it's all going to change to use your new shiny CSS overnight. It might never. So we had to pick our battles really carefully. The last bit was really interesting because we had this quite purist, really nicely structured bit of SAS, CSS stuff in the corner there going, this is amazing. But you start dropping it into lots of other code bases and you realize we hadn't coded defensively enough because they're not predictable. they were all done at different times by different people. There were different reset styles and all this stuff going on. So there's loads to learn from just dropping your code into different code bases. And so we've got loads of shareable things now. Obviously, there's a car part theme going on. But really, this is the chunk I want to get into, because it's now, all of that stuff is kind of the past, the journey that we've been on to get to where we are. And there's been some great learnings out of it. There's certainly been degrees of success, but this isn't a finished thing. So with current evolution, we've decided to shun car names or car part names, partly because we're running out, and it's like when a joke wears a bit thin. So it's just auto-traded design system. All the people bit has shown us that the notion of governance, processes, and workflow are fundamental to making it work. So we have a load of ideas about how to craft a community around it. And there's a sense of, you're going to have people experimenting and solving different problems across the business. So how can we create a process and a workflow which listens and then can make it into the right conventions and the right format for general consumption? How do we communicate what problem that solves? And maybe it's a shared problem. And again, hammering home, it's all about communication. So on the code side, we still didn't have like a remit to have a huge team around a design system or anything. So a lot of this stuff is off the back of a brand refresh, just cleaning it up, changing the color palette, all that sort of stuff. And so in the code, as we started to make these new components, we started to question a few things and talk very much about certain conventions, especially on the component level. So we can start to see, well, oh, that's interesting what you've done over there. Maybe that should be in all these components. And so in this early stage of just communicating a lot about why we've made certain choices, sometimes having really quite anal discussions about, well, no, it should be called this, it should be called that, because naming is really important. Fundamentally, a lot of this stuff came down to what gives us confidence in the output. If you've got tests around your components of different kinds, like visual regression testing or other automated tests, that's all good stuff. But are we confident in our output, and are other people confident in using it? That's a really big thing to explore. And overall, the simplicity of developer experience is really key. We can't make this really, really difficult to consume and to use. So very much like earlier iterations, we use Storybook to show our components, but we're starting to build up a sense of structure around the documentation. And again, we're kind of charging forwards with output at the same time as making the design system. So we're starting to bring in some stuff around writing copy for your buttons, accessibility, and Storybook with React components gives you this props table for free. So you can say to a technical person, this is what you can expect when you try and use this component. And so with ATDS being more modern, we're using design tokens, which is essentially a way of storing values in JSON files. That runs through a generator. In this case, we're using a project called Style Dictionary. And that takes your tokens and spits them out through templates into something you can consume, which could be Sass, could be style components, and we're looking into how we use that for native apps. Beyond that, we've got layers of complexity for components. So elements like a button can't get any smaller and have a clear use case. Patterns get a bit more complex, but still use one or more elements and some of the foundations. And collections tend to bring a few patterns together. So as a dev experience, you import a few components from the design system. In your render method in React, it's relatively easy to read. And we try and keep copy and image references in a separate file just to make it cleaner. So less technical people should be able to go in and change a reference or change some copy. And so far for landing pages and stuff, that kind of works. It also gives us options in future to make more abstractions. But it should be, if you see it in a browser, you should be able to make sense of that code. On the design side, there's a real push to bring brand closer to UI. So we all understand our brand personality traits. how to interpret the brand when it comes to the specific UI. And we are really trying to work hard and build a community around this thing. We have to make sure design and developers, both within their separate communities and together, really understand it's a team sport. And while we're trying to shepherd it through, we need and want their involvement as much as they want to be. And for designers, actually, there's a shift with seeing the code that's on the live website is the source of truth, because that is what the user experiences. If that's not right, then we need to change that to make it right. And if you have the design library, then that needs to reflect, there needs to be one-on-one, it needs to match. So one of the main takeaways is don't skimp on the people bit. Take people on the journey, make that feedback loop. And one of the most powerful things that I've learned is creating advocates, whether that's people, peers in your same community of developers or designers, product people, delivery people, having people that get it and can communicate on your behalf. It's a really powerful thing. And certainly this time around, while we feel we're communicating fairly well, we're trying to do quite a lot of outreach and talk to different groups of people and explain at least the top level stuff. Why are we doing this and what benefit can it bring? So again, as a relative of communication, it's about that shared understanding. It's just here to solve problems, user problems or business problems. And these Lego bricks, for want of a better term, just help you to find a solution to that particular problem. So these kind of bits of advice, you know what, there's 100 different ways of doing this stuff. The outcome might look similar, but just be prepared to be wrong and don't get too wedded to one particular approach or too precious. Whether you're a designer or a developer, this stuff has to work for other people other than you. So you can't go off in a corner and just make something you think is perfect. As easy as that is, because it's closed, the hardest thing is to engage with people and really understand their needs and how it can make what you're making better. So you have to be adaptable and pragmatic and keep focusing on the value you can bring to the teams. Be quite clear, you're not going to solve every problem perfectly first time. So we're looking at things like what GDS do, creating a community and talking about support, bringing in some of the research insights that Bulb do, try and make that part of it. In an early version of what Co-op did, I love the way that it's super clear what the use cases were and calling out stuff like user needs and accessibility and how to suggest a change. And I quite like this quote to sum it up. The technical approach doesn't matter as much as creating a living, breathing system that's flexible, maintainable, stable, scalable, and successful in the long term. It's so easy to get blinded by exciting new tech or something like that. But that's not what it really is. It's about communication, shared understanding, and people. So a design system is a journey, not a finished thing. And for us, it feels like even though we've done all of this stuff, we're still just getting started. There's so much to go at. And so I know being from AutoTrader, the careers people would love me to just drop this in at the end. We're always hiring good people. If you're curious about what we do, go and check us out.